Welcome to True Echo, where powerful stories echo through time. Today's story is one of dignity, brotherhood, and a moment that stunned the nation. What began as a quiet journey to pay respects turned into a public reckoning, when one man's quiet past met a military's loud mistake. Stay with us, because this is the story they tried to overlook, until the most powerful man in the cemetery brought it all to a stop. The train hissed and wheezed as it slowed to a stop at Union Station in Washington, D.C., beneath a sky just beginning to bloom with the light of day. Clarence Del Roy, 82 years old and wearing a brown wool blazer that had seen more Sundays than most churches, stood slowly from his seat. His hands, veined and weathered, tugged lightly at his white shirt cuffs. His trousers, pressed to near perfection, sagged a little at the waist, but his shoes gleamed. Not because he expected anyone to notice, but because it mattered to him. Across the aisle, a woman, maybe mid-30s, kind eyes, smiled as Clarence retrieved a worn leather bag. "You visiting family, sir?" she asked, polite southern lilt curling in her voice. Clarence returned her smile, soft but tired. "No, ma'am. A friend. Funeral." "Oh," she said, her voice dipping respectfully. He nodded, adjusted his brown felt hat, and turned toward the exit. No need to explain further. Not today. Outside, the DC air had bite to it, diesel fumes, the faint aroma of coffee, and something sweet from a nearby vendor cart. Clarence took it all in with the stillness of a man who'd lived long enough to know when silence said more than words. He walked with a stiff gait, not from weakness but from too many years pushing mops on hard floors. 43 years at Langston High in Birmingham. Never missed a day. Except the week his wife died. There was no one left now. No children. No siblings. Just him, and this letter in his pocket, folded with reverence, addressed in neat cursive. "Mr. Clarence Del Roy, please escort to front. Sincerely, Rebecca Beckett." He arrived at Arlington National Cemetery by taxi, nodding to the driver who commented, "Big service today. 4-star general. Gonna be packed." "Yes," Clarence answered. He was a good man. The gates of the cemetery loomed with reverent silence. Rows of chairs beneath a green canopy were already filling up. Military officers in full dress stood in attention, brass glinting in the morning sun. At the center, a flag-draped casket rested, General Thomas Beckett, U.S. Army, retired. Clarence's childhood friend. His war buddy. His brother in all but blood. He approached the South Gate checkpoint with a slow but steady stride and offered the envelope to a young officer, maybe 25. "I was told to show this." The officer squinted at the handwriting, read the name aloud, then glanced at Clarence with a polite but forced smile. "Sir, do you have your name on the official list?" Clarence shook his head. "I was told this would do. I knew the general. Served with him." The taller officer beside him leaned in. "We need verified clearance." "Sorry. High-level event." Clarence nodded slowly. His voice, low and calm but heavy, returned, "I came a long way. I'm not here to cause trouble. That man," he pointed gently toward the casket, "I pulled him out of a rice field in Vietnam. Just trying to pay my respects." Still, the answer was no. Clarence stepped aside, hat pressed to his chest. People in suits and dresses passed him, offering awkward glances or no acknowledgement at all. He leaned against the stone wall, knees aching, sweat forming beneath his collar. He unfolded a photo from his coat pocket. 2 young soldiers, muddy and grinning. Beckett's arm wrapped around his shoulder. A moment from another lifetime. A memory that felt more real than the sun on his face. He waited. Minutes passed. A younger soldier with a clipboard walked by. Clarence tried again, voice softer now, like he wasn't just being denied entry to a funeral, but pushed back into a life he thought he'd outlived. "Son. I'm trying to get in. I served with the general. The soldier nodded politely, took the letter, and promised to check with the coordinator. But he never came back. The sun had risen higher now, casting a glare on the polished shoes and brass buttons of arriving guests. Clarence remained at the stone wall, invisible in plain sight. The envelope he had shown 3 times now felt heavier in his coat pocket than it should have. His hands, clasped behind his back, twitched every so often, nerves or frustration, even he wasn't sure. The buzz of a bugle warmed up in the background. A small boy skipped by, holding his mother's hand, his dress shoes tapping the pavement. Clarence gave him a soft smile that went unseen. He looked down, adjusted the collar of his blazer, and took a steadying breath. It had been a long trip. He'd woken before sunrise, caught the first train from Birmingham, and made it here on time. All to say goodbye. He reached again into his pocket, this time retrieving a small, worn piece of cloth. Faded green. 2 stitched letters. T.B. Beckett had made it for him in 1968, an armband cut from his own uniform after Quantum. "You wear that," Beckett had said, "so even if I don't make it, I'm still with you." Clarence slipped the armband over his wrist with fingers that trembled slightly. It wasn't just cloth. It was proof of a bond deeper than any list or clearance pass. And yet, still no one came to get him. The junior officers at the checkpoint avoided his gaze now, focusing on clipboards, radios, anything but the man just a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't shout. Just waited, patient, quiet, with a kind of dignity that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Inside, under the canopy, the funeral had started. The chaplain's voice drifted across the lawn, solemn and sure. Guests sat straight, some dabbing their eyes. Officers sat by rank, civilians by family name. All according to protocol. All according to a list. Clarence wasn't on that list. He could hear every word of the eulogy, yet feel none of its comfort. He stared at the canopy, his lips tight, eyes burning. He'd been left off rosters before. Forgotten in group photos. Once, in 1973, after a memorial for a fellow vet, a reporter had asked him if he was just the janitor. He'd smiled, said yes, and walked away. But this was different. This was Tom. As the chaplain spoke of Beckett's valor, his campaigns, his decades of leadership, Clarence recalled a very different Beckett, the boy who once climbed a water tower and broke his arm, the soldier who had cursed him out while bleeding in the jungle, the general who showed up on Clarence's porch with a wrench because he heard the water heater was acting up. This wasn't about honors. It wasn't even about respect. It was about memory. And then, something shifted. From the far side of the field, movement. A man in full military dress walked with deliberate steps down the central path. His uniform was impeccable, the ribbons on his chest brilliant in the sunlight. But what stopped Clarence cold was the 4 stars on each shoulder. General Raymond E. Callister. Clarence's heart pounded. He didn't recognize him personally, but everyone knew the name. A man who didn't just rise through ranks, he carved through walls to make space for those beneath him. He was known for brevity, for cutting through nonsense, and for saluting not just authority but loyalty. Callister stopped mid-path and turned to a nearby staff sergeant. "Who's the man at the south gate?" he asked. The sergeant glanced nervously. "Sir. I believe he wasn't cleared, security couldn't confirm his name on the list." Callister raised a hand, silencing him. "Hold the ceremony." The chaplain's voice cut off. A murmur rippled through the seated guests. Heads turned. Soldiers stiffened. Callister walked. Purposeful. Eyes fixed on Clarence. The junior officers at the checkpoint jolted to attention, shoulders back. "General Callister, sir," one began. But Callister didn't break stride. He walked straight up to Clarence and stopped. Clarence straightened, instinctively slipping his hat off and placing it against his chest. His voice, low and cautious, came out steady. Sir. Callister gave a slight nod. What's your name? Clarence Del Roy, he answered. You knew General Beckett? Clarence looked him in the eye, and for the first time that morning, his voice didn't waver. Since I was 9. Served with him in Quantum, 68. Callister stood still for a beat. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand in a full military salute. Not a nod. Not a token gesture. A full salute. Clarence blinked. The wind caught his coat slightly. For a second, the only sound was the ripple of flags in the breeze. Callister lowered his arm and stepped forward. Mr. Del Roy, he said, offering his elbow, would you allow me the honor of escorting you to your seat? Clarence opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He nodded once. The two men, one old, bent by time, the other powerful in uniform, walked together down the paved path toward the funeral. The crowd parted in stunned silence. Officers straightened. Civilians leaned forward. As they neared the canopy, Rebecca Beckett, widow of the general, stood. Her eyes, full of tears, locked on Clarence. I told them you'd come, she whispered, taking his hand. Clarence squeezed her fingers gently. Behind him, General Callister nodded to the chaplain. You may continue. Clarence took his seat beside Rebecca. The seat meant for him. Saved not by a list, but by memory, by love, by 70 years of brotherhood. And for the first time that day, Clarence exhaled. He was exactly where he belonged. Clarence sat perfectly upright in the front row, the flag-draped casket of General Thomas Beckett only a few feet ahead. His hat now rested on his knee, his hands gently folded on top. To his right, Rebecca Beckett's hand remained lightly resting over his own, a small but resolute anchor between past and present. She hadn't said much, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone carried more weight than the words uttered by anyone at the pulpit so far. As the chaplain resumed the service, Clarence's eyes remained locked on the casket. He hardly heard the eulogy. Phrases like, service above self, dedicated leader, and defender of liberty, blurred into the background. They were all true, of course. But those words weren't Tom Beckett. Tom was the boy who once gave Clarence his only sandwich when Clarence forgot his lunch. He was the teenager who'd taken a baseball bat to a white kid's bicycle when that kid had called Clarence a slur. He was the fresh-faced lieutenant who joked through ambushes and death traps like they were just potholes on the road of life. And he was the general who still came back to Birmingham every few years, no matter how high he climbed, just to sit with Clarence on that old porch and listen to the crickets. What mattered wasn't his title. It was that he had never forgotten who sat beside him in the mud. Halfway through the service, Beckett's eldest son, Theodore, leaned over from 2 seats away. He was broad-shouldered, square-jawed, a man molded in his father's image. Mr. Del Roy, he whispered, voice thick with emotion, thank you. Dad always said you were the reason he ever came home. Clarence gave a small smile. We kept each other alive. One way or another. Theodore nodded, swallowing hard. And in that moment, Clarence felt something he hadn't felt all morning, not recognition from the crowd, not the hollow comfort of institutional formality, but connection. The kind that only truth can forge. As the final prayer approached, a crisp uniformed Marine stepped forward and began folding the flag atop the casket. His movements were slow, methodical, and precise. With each fold, Clarence felt a heartbeat echo in his chest. Once folded into a perfect triangle, the Marine approached Rebecca Beckett, offering the flag with steady arms. But Rebecca didn't reach for it. Instead, she turned to Clarence, tears swimming in her eyes, and said, Tom wanted you to have this. Clarence instinctively began to protest. Rebecca, She gently shook her head. You saved his life. And you never once asked for anything in return. He told me if anything ever happened, this flag belonged to you. With trembling hands, she passed it to him. Clarence received it like one might receive a newborn child, delicately, reverently, holding it tight against his chest. His throat closed, and he had to blink quickly to clear his vision. No medals ever meant as much as this. And yet, the most personal moment of the day was still to come. As the guests slowly began to stand, murmuring their farewells, Clarence remained seated. He held the flag in his lap, both hands wrapped around it. His face bore the look of a man remembering too much too fast. Rebecca leaned over again. "Tom wrote something for you. A few days before he passed." She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope, no stamp, no address, just his name written in a familiar, looping scrawl, Clarence. Clarence took it gently, his fingers trembling slightly as he cradled it like something sacred. He didn't open it right away. Not because he didn't want to read it, but because he wasn't ready for the sound of Tom's voice to vanish. Instead, he sat in silence as the crowd began thinning. The rifle salute cracked across the hills. The bugle followed, its final note hanging in the air like a held breath, suspended between earth and memory. Only when the silence returned did Clarence carefully unfold the letter. The paper was thick, folded neatly into thirds. A few smudges where the pen had pressed too hard. He read. "Clarence. If you're reading this, I made it somewhere you can't follow. Not yet anyway. I tried writing this a dozen times. Kept starting over. How do you write to the one man who knew you before the uniform and never flinched after the medals?" Clarence's eyes didn't move. He simply stared at the page, lips barely parting as he mouthed each word silently. "I still think about that day in Quantum. Not because I nearly died, but because I realized something that day: you don't need rank to be a hero. You just need guts. You had more than anyone I've ever known." A tear slipped down Clarence's cheek. He didn't wipe it away this time. "They gave me stars, medals, applause, but they never saw what you did. You didn't carry me out of that field for glory. You did it because we were brothers. And I never forgot it. If Rebecca gets this to you, and you're sitting at my funeral, remember something: that seat wasn't given to you. It was yours all along. Always. Your brother. Tom." Clarence folded the letter slowly. Pressed it against his chest. And for a long moment, said nothing. No words. Just wait. Memory. And love. The funeral was ending. Staff began collecting chairs. Quiet conversations resumed. The crowd thinned, people retreating toward parking lots and polished SUVs. But Clarence stayed. He rose slowly, flag under his arm, the letter tucked into his coat. And he stepped toward the casket. The sun had begun to lean toward afternoon now, casting long shadows over the green lawn. Clarence approached the casket with deliberate slowness, resting one hand gently on the polished wood. "I know I ain't supposed to speak," he said aloud, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the few lingering around him. "But I need to. Not for the general. Not for the family. For me." A few heads turned. Clarence removed his hat and held it at his side. His face was calm. But his words rang with history. "I knew Tom Beckett before any of y'all called him sir. Before the politics. Before the medals. He was just Tom to me. The boy who gave me his lunch. The soldier who cracked jokes when we were getting shelled. The man who showed up to fix my water heater even when he outranked half the state." A few people smiled through their tears. Clarence looked down at the casket again. "He carried me too," he said softly. "Not like I carried him, but in ways that mattered more." Then Clarence did something rare, something no one expected. He lifted his hand in a salute. It wasn't perfect. His elbow shook slightly. His fingers didn't quite align. But it was real. It was full of decades. And then, a voice rang out behind him. "Detail, attention. Clarence turned slightly. General Callister had risen. He faced the casket. Raised his hand in a crisp, textbook-perfect salute. Then, almost like a ripple, 24 uniformed men and women across the field, some seated, some mid-step, all stopped. One by one, they followed suit. Officers. Cadets. Enlisted. All saluting, not because protocol demanded it, but because they'd witnessed something greater than a regulation. And Clarence, for the first time that day, didn't feel like someone trying to prove he belonged. He knew. He had always belonged. Clarence stood at the edge of the platform, surrounded by an unexpected sea of silent salutes. His own hand trembled slightly as he returned the gesture, his aging frame straight yet softened by emotion. The triangle-folded flag remained cradled beneath his arm like the last piece of a long chapter finally complete. The moment held. No sounds. No movement. Only wind, whistling softly through the towering trees of Arlington and rustling the leaves like a gentle applause. And then, as if signaled by something older than time, General Callister lowered his hand. One by one, the others followed suit, dropping their salutes with solemn respect. But their eyes lingered on Clarence, like he was the center of gravity pulling generations of service and sacrifice into a single, quiet focal point. Callister stepped forward again, no aides, no escort, just a man in full uniform crossing the short distance back toward the casket. His boots moved over the paved path with the same weight he used to carry in battle. He stopped in front of Clarence and extended his hand. "Mr. Del Roy," he said clearly. "Thank you. For your service. For your sacrifice. And for what you gave General Beckett, long before any of us ever met him." Clarence shook the general's hand, firm but reverent. "You honored him today, sir," Callister said, eyes steady. "More than any speech ever could." Clarence gave a small nod. "He honored me long before this day." The general stepped back, nodded once to Rebecca, then returned to his seat. But the impact of his words, of that single salute, remained long after. Clarence turned back toward the casket. The crowd had thinned almost entirely now. Staff began gently collapsing the white folding chairs. The honor guard that had fired the rifle salute earlier was now dispersing. The chaplain said a few final quiet words to Rebecca, then excused himself. Still, Clarence remained. He lowered himself onto the small stone ledge near the grave, his knees protesting, but his soul unwilling to leave just yet. The folded flag rested in his lap. The envelope was tucked safely in his breast pocket. But his eyes were on the casket. He stared for a long moment, his breathing slow. Steady. Then finally, he whispered. "I told myself I wouldn't talk long, Tom. Guess that ship sailed." His voice was soft, not quite speech, not quite prayer. Just a conversation between old friends, the kind that doesn't need a response to be understood. "You remember that summer in '55 when you broke your arm climbing the water tower? Out behind Jackson's farm," he chuckled lightly. "I told you not to. Told you the ladder was rusted." He shook his head, a smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't listen. Never did." Clarence leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Around him, the cemetery was still. The sun had shifted, bathing the nearby tombstones in warm light. The world, it seemed, had paused just for him. "I still remember the look on your mama's face when we walked down the street, me dragging your sari behind and you crying like a fool. She didn't even ask what happened. Just handed me a cold rag and pointed to the porch." He went quiet then. Swallowed once. "I never said it right, probably 'cause I didn't know how. But I loved you like my own blood, Tom. You weren't just a friend. You were my family." He looked down at his hands, weathered, worn, but steady. "I always thought we'd go out together one day. Side by side. Gray and slow. Arguing about whose knees were worse. A breeze kicked up, rustling the leaves above them. Clarence reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a silver chain. Dog tags. The same ones Tom had given him in 1970 before redeploying. He ran his thumb over the engraved letters for a moment, then rose slowly, carefully, and stepped back toward the casket. With a quiet reverence, he placed the tags gently on top of the wooden surface, just beneath the flag's edge. I figured it's time they go back where they belong. He stood in silence for a few moments, then looked toward the ground beneath his feet. I'll carry what's left of US, Tom. Like I always have. But I want you to know, whatever you thought you owed me, you paid it. Every time you showed up. Every time you called. Every time you sat on that porch and let me feel seen. He blinked, slow and heavy. I'll be all right. I'll keep walking. But I won't forget. I can't. Then Clarence did something he hadn't done in decades. He brought his hands together. Clasped them in front of him. Closed his eyes. And prayed. Lord, thank you for letting me know this man. Thank you for letting us grow old, even if we didn't grow old together. And thank you, for letting him rest today with someone who remembered who he really was. He opened his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. It swooped down across the sky and vanished into a thicket of trees beyond the headstones. Clarence gave the casket one final look. Then turned. And began the long, slow walk back down the paved road, his shadow stretching out behind him, long and unwavering. He passed the empty rows of white chairs, now being stacked two at a time. Past the now quiet hill, where families once sat whispering stories. Each footstep was grounded, deliberate. Each step a memory. And though he walked alone, Clarence Del Roy did not walk unnoticed. A week later, the heat returned to Birmingham with a vengeance, clinging to porches and sidewalks like an old grudge. Clarence Del Roy was kneeling on the front porch of Mrs. Patterson's house 2 blocks from his own. Her door had been sticking at the top, just enough to make her grumble every time she came back from church. Clarence had told her 3 times already he'd come by and fix it. That morning, he finally did. He had a screwdriver in one hand, a small folding stool beneath him that creaked every time he shifted his weight, and a glass of lemonade sweating beside his tools. His shirt clung slightly to his back, but he didn't complain. Never did. Work was work, and his hands hadn't forgotten how to make things right. From inside the house, Mrs. Patterson peeked out, clutching a small hand fan and calling, "Mr. Clarence, you sure you want to do that in this heat? You ought to be resting." He didn't look up. "I'm already here," he said simply, voice calm. "Ain't no point waiting till it gets worse." He took a sip of the lemonade, nodded once in approval, and went back to work. That's how Clarence lived. Quietly. Purposefully. No need for show. His own house was simple, 2 bedrooms, white siding, a small garden out front that hadn't seen much attention lately. But inside, the letter from General Beckett now sat framed on the mantel. The flag folded in a triangle case was placed on a table by the window, sunlight catching its glass front each morning. He didn't talk about the funeral much. Not even to his barber, who had known him since 1964. But then something unusual happened. "Mr. Clarence," a boy called from the sidewalk, sprinting up the porch steps so fast the railing rattled. "You're on the internet." Clarence blinked. "I'm what?" The boy held up his phone, breathless. "My uncle showed me, look, it's you. At the funeral." And there it was. Grainy footage captured from someone's phone camera. A tall figure in uniform walking with purpose. General Callister. A crowd parting. And then, Clarence. Standing at the gate. The salute. The stillness. The moment when everything stopped. The video had over 1 million views. The title read, 4-star General halts funeral for unknown elderly man, then the truth stuns everyone. Clarence watched a few seconds, then handed the phone back. He said, turning back to the door frame. That's something. The boy looked puzzled. You're not excited? Clarence smiled faintly. That wasn't for the cameras, son. That was just a man doing right by another man. And that was that. But the world had noticed. A local paper reached out. Then a national veterans group. Someone from a military podcast called and left 3 voicemails. A producer from California offered to fly him out for an interview. Clarence gave them all the same answer. I already said what I needed to say. Still, some moments find their way back to the light no matter how much you try to leave them in peace. One morning, Clarence sat at his kitchen table and carefully penned a letter. Neat handwriting. No flourish. Just truth. General Callister. Thank you. For stopping. For looking me in the eye. For not needing proof. I didn't expect what you did. But I won't forget it. You saw me. And you saw Tom in me. That's enough. Clarence Del Roy. He mailed it the next day. No return address. Just folded it neatly and let it go. Life moved on. He repaired a broken window screen for the widowed man across the street. Volunteered twice a month in the Langston High School library, where he used to work. He'd sort books, shelve paperbacks alphabetically, and occasionally nod off in the corner chair. The new librarian never woke him. Just pulled the blanket from the back room and covered his lap gently. Still, the funeral lingered, quietly. Like a ghost not unwelcome, but ever present. People at the grocery store recognized him. You're that man, they'd say. Clarence would nod. Shake their hand. Maybe say, he was a good friend. But he never gave them more. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew some stories only lived fully between 2 people. And one of them was already gone. But sometimes, silence isn't what people need. 3 weeks after the funeral, Clarence was walking through a small park near downtown when he noticed a young man in uniform sitting alone on a bench. He looked restless. Nervous. Elbows on knees. A duffel bag at his feet. Clarence sat down beside him, not close, but enough to share the space. The young man glanced sideways. Then double-taked. You that guy from Arlington? Clarence didn't answer. Just gave a soft smile. The young man nodded slowly. My granddad showed me the video, he said. Said, that's how men used to carry themselves. Clarence looked out toward the trees. We just tried not to forget each other. The soldier went quiet. They sat in silence for a while longer, no rank, no ceremony. Just 2 people, side by side. When Clarence rose to go, the soldier stood too. Without a word, he lifted his hand and saluted. No camera. No crowd. Just a single moment. Clarence tipped his hat in return. And walked on. Because in the end, it wasn't about medals. Or lists. Or headlines. It was about showing up. About being remembered. And maybe, just maybe, about reminding a few folks what honor still looks like. That night, as thunder rolled softly over Birmingham's skyline and the crickets began their chorus, Clarence Del Roy sat alone on his back porch. The cicadas had long gone quiet for the season, but the stillness hadn't. He leaned back in his chair with a blanket draped across his lap, a glass of water on one side and the letter from Tom, Beckett, on the other. He unfolded it again. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every word. But he read it anyway. If Rebecca gets this to you, and you're sitting at my funeral, remember something, that seat wasn't given to you. It was yours all along. The words lingered in his chest like a second heartbeat. He looked out into the dark and thought about everything they'd survived. Segregated buses. Quiet discrimination. Vietnam's unforgiving jungle. The empty ache of returning to a country that didn't wave the same flag for every soldier. And yet here he was. A man who had once been mistaken for a janitor at another veterans memorial, now remembered as the soul of one. It still felt surreal, until the doorbell rang the next morning. Clarence shuffled slowly to the front door, expecting it to be the mailman or one of the neighbors' kids with a fresh batch of school fundraiser chocolates. Instead, he opened the door to find a sharply dressed woman in a blazer with a gold pin of the U.S. Department of Defense. "Mr. Del Roy?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Major Sloan with the Pentagon's Veterans Legacy Program. I was asked by General Callister personally to deliver this." She handed him a thick envelope with official markings. Clarence opened it slowly, glancing over the header: Posthumous Commendation Nomination, Civilian Valor and Brotherhood in Combat, Con Tum Province, Vietnam, 1968. There was a letter tucked inside, signed by General Callister himself. "Mr. Del Roy. In my 35 years of military service, I have given many speeches, shaken thousands of hands, and signed more citations than I can count. But few names have ever meant more than the one I learned standing at that gate. You carried more than a friend out of danger. You carried an ideal that transcends orders, policy, and time. It is my honor to submit your name for formal recognition of what should have been acknowledged long ago. Not because you asked for it, but because you lived it. With the utmost respect. General R. E. Callister." Clarence lowered the letter, face unreadable. "I don't need no medals," he said softly. Major Sloan nodded. "General Callister said you'd say that. But he also said, sometimes we correct history not to reward the man, but to remind the country." Clarence exhaled. The letter trembled just slightly in his hand. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. The major gave him a crisp nod and stepped back. "If you ever want to speak at Langley, or West Point, there are cadets who'd benefit from your words." Clarence chuckled. "Ma'am, I haven't given a speech since 1981, and that was about cafeteria safety." She smiled, tipped her head, and left. Clarence closed the door behind her and walked slowly back to his chair, the official letter heavy in his hands. He placed it next to Tom's. And sat in the silence. Later that afternoon, he walked to the edge of his backyard, where an old pear tree leaned slightly like an aging sentinel. He hadn't picked its fruit in years, but Tom had helped plant it the summer before deployment. As he stood beneath it, Clarence felt something shift. Not in the air, but in him. A quiet resolve. He walked back inside, picked up his phone, and made a call. The next Sunday, dressed in a fresh gray suit and the same Navy veteran's cap he wore to the funeral, Clarence stood at the front of the small community church where he and Tom had once served as altar boys. The congregation looked surprised. Clarence hadn't taken the pulpit in decades. But when he spoke, the room leaned forward. "I ain't here to give a sermon," he began, voice steady. "Just a story." And for the next 20 minutes, he told them about a boy who once stole his lunch, then gave it back with twice the kindness. About the boy who climbed a rusted water tower and fell. About the jungle. The smoke. The blood. And the friendship that never needed permission to endure. He didn't talk about the funeral video. Didn't mention the headlines. He talked about showing up. And being seen. And how that, more than any rank or ribbon, is what honor truly looks like. He ended with one simple sentence. If you've got a Clarence or a Tom in your life, don't wait. Let them know today. After the service, the line of handshakes stretched around the pews. Some were veterans. Some were students. One woman whispered, "My husband was in Con Tum, too. He never talked about it. You just gave me a piece of him back." Clarence nodded, eyes soft. "Tell him thank you for me." By sunset, he was back on his porch, sipping iced tea, watching the sky blush orange and gold. He thought of Tom. Of that summer when they first met. Of jungle heat and friendship forged in fire. Of Rebecca's trembling hands passing him the flag. And of a general who knew, without being told, what was right. He looked out toward the horizon and whispered, "I think we're finally square, Tom." And then he smiled. Not wide. Not flashy. Just enough. Weeks turned into months, but the story of Clarence Del Roy didn't fade. If anything, it spread quietly, whispered in veteran halls, recounted in classrooms, posted on forums where strangers nodded along to a story they hadn't lived but somehow felt in their bones. But Clarence? He never chased the echo of his own moment. He simply continued doing what he'd always done, showing up. One morning, he returned to Langston High School, the same school he'd cleaned for 43 years. He wasn't there to visit the faculty lounge or relive glory days, he was there to volunteer again. This time, not with a mop in hand, but as a quiet presence in the library and history classes. "Just don't ask me to grade no papers," he told the principal with a smirk. They didn't. Instead, he sat in the back of the room and listened. Sometimes he shared a thought. Sometimes a joke. And once, just once, he told the Quantum story to a room full of wide-eyed teens, most of whom didn't even know what the Vietnam War really was. He told it slow. Not for drama, but for weight. He described the mud. The smoke. The fear. And the friendship that pulled him through it. "But the war ain't the story," he said at the end. "The real story's what you do after. When no one's looking. When there's no medals left to earn." Afterward, one student, tall, wiry, maybe 17, approached him quietly. "Mr. Clarence," he asked, "did General Beckett really say you saved his life?" Clarence paused. "He said it," he replied. "But truth is, he saved mine too. We saved each other." The student nodded slowly. "My uncle served in Iraq. I don't think he talks about it much. But I think, maybe he needs someone like that too." Clarence rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then be that someone." Outside the classroom, the sun cast long shadows over the school's parking lot. Clarence stepped into the light, adjusted his cap, and made his way home. A package was waiting on his doorstep. He carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the brown envelope carefully. Inside was a plaque, engraved with his name and a citation for civilian valor in combat, signed and sealed by the Department of Defense. There was no ceremony. No cameras. Just a plaque in a box. And still, Clarence smiled. He placed it on the mantel, beside the folded flag, beside Tom's letter, beside a photo of them both grinning in jungle mud. Later that evening, his cousin stopped by with peach cobbler and a curious glint in her eye. "You know you've become somewhat of a legend, right?" Clarence chuckled. "I'm just a man with a good pair of shoes and too much time on his hands." She waved him off. "They're planning to name the new VA wing after you. Clarence Del Roy Center for Veteran Honor." He nearly dropped his fork. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," she said gently. "That's why they're doing it." That night, after she left, Clarence sat again beneath the old pear tree. He didn't talk much. Just sat. But he did pull something from his pocket, a second letter. One he'd written a few days earlier. One he hadn't mailed yet. It was addressed to Theodore Beckett. "Theodore. Thank you for welcoming me into your family that day. Your father would have been proud of the man you are. I wanted you to know that the flag you gave me is in good hands. And so is his story. If ever your children or grandchildren want to know who he really was, tell them about the water tower. Tell them about the porch. Tell them about how he looked a man in the eye even when the world looked away. Tell them he kept his promises. And that I'll be keeping mine, too. Always. Clarence." He sealed the envelope, stood slowly, and walked back toward the porch. Each step felt lighter than the last. That weekend, the town held its annual Veterans Parade. Clarence never marched in it before. Never saw the point. But this time, he said yes. As he walked beside a float carrying children waving small flags, someone in the crowd called out, "Mr. Clarence. Salute again like you did in the video." He laughed, shook his head, but then did it anyway. The crowd erupted. And for just a moment, he raised his hand to his brow. The salute wasn't crisp. His elbow wobbled. But it didn't matter. It wasn't about form. It was about memory. About love. About showing up. About being seen, when it mattered most. And as the parade marched on, Clarence Del Roy walked forward, not for the crowd, not for the medal, not even for the applause. But for the promise he made in a jungle decades ago, and for the brother who never let him go. Some stories are too sacred for cameras, too real for just one headline. Clarence Del Roy never asked to be remembered. But in honoring a friend, he reminded a nation what brotherhood truly means. In a world that often forgets, he showed us how to remember. If this story moved you, let it echo. Subscribe to True Echo for more unforgettable stories. Comment below if someone in your life deserves to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to know what real honor still looks like.